like I said, I'm Robert. I work in right around downtown Charlotte and for one of the hospital systems called Levine. And I have some fellow Levine teammates over here, so welcome them with me. Thanks for joining me today. And really happy to be here just to talk about a little bit about Parkinson's disease. So probably 60, 70% of the people that I'm seeing are people who have Parkinson's disease. So it's something that I don't want to say I enjoy treating it, but it's something that I think that is really important, and it's something that's important to me, and it's something a passion I have behind it. I would rather treat Parkinson's disease any day of the day. So thanks so much for coming and listening. But I wanted to also just kind of share quickly that this is some tough topics that we're going to talk about, right? So we're going to talk about some mental health issues. And we're going to talk about really three things: so depression, anxiety, and then we're going to talk about this thing called psychosis or hallucination. So I'm actually glad that it's a little bit of a smaller room tonight, just so we can be a little bit more in a more intimate setting to talk about some of these things. And really, really, please do write down questions if you have a piece of paper in front of you. I'm really just here to help, and I want to help out if I can. So like I said, my name is Robert. I actually grew up just north of here in Mooresville, North Carolina. And then I went to school over eastward way in Chapel Hill and spent a lot of years there, perhaps too many years, and then went up to Virginia to do some more training in neurology at UVA. And then I guess about a year and a half ago, got back to New York City, where I learned all about Parkinson's disease. So this is what I've been doing for a while, and I'm really excited to be here to talk a little bit more about it. So we're going to talk about how I actually always start my talks about what is Parkinson's disease and how do I diagnose it, and just some important things that I think are important, mostly so we can all get on the same page, right? So we can all know a little bit more about my side of things. So whenever I'm in the clinic interacting with my patients, and whether it's patients that have Parkinson's disease or patients who don't have Parkinson's disease, just kind of what's going on in my head and try to figure out what is the actual diagnosis here. And then we will talk about anxious thoughts and something called generalized anxiety disorder. And then we'll talk a little bit about sadness, grieving, depression. And then we'll talk about hallucinations and something called psychosis, and we'll define those a little bit later. And then lastly, we will go to the sheets of paper in front of you and answer any questions you have. So what is Parkinson's disease? So I always show this slide, but this is James Parkinson, who in 1817 described a few of his people in his town who he had noticed had some shaking and some trouble walking. And I'll go through this slide, but what they ended up deciding was that all these people had some similar features, right? So they all had similar shakes or similar trouble walking and had similar other symptoms. And they ended up grouping them together, and James, is why we call this whole thing Parkinson's disease. So I like to say that the diagnosis can be straightforward sometimes. So sometimes me and my colleagues, we can walk into a room and we know pretty quickly what's going on just by interacting with someone. And the way we can do that is because there's 4 cardinal features of Parkinson's disease. And the first one that we look for is a rest tremor. So that's not just any tremor where someone holds their hands out and they start shaking. It's really important that tremor is at rest. So for some reason, I always think about it, imagine you're sitting at home and watching Netflix, and your hands just relax in your lap, and you have some shaking or some tremor. So that's the type of tremor that we see in Parkinson's, a rest tremor. There can also be some rigidity or stiffness in joints. There's also slowness in what we call rapid alternating movements. So if you're in my clinic, a lot of the clinics, doctor will do this, just to try to figure out how quickly you're able to make movements. And the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease starts to come in when you start to notice that one side of the body is a little bit more effective than the other side, or one side is slower than the other. And that is whenever we start to look for other side symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Now, this postural instability, that really means some really effectively walking trouble, which can be pretty common in Parkinson's. I know that a lot of my patients describe some balance troubles that they can have. So that's very common in Parkinson's. Now, there are a lot of different criteria or different ways that we look at it. And this is the old way that we used to think about Parkinson's disease, where someone might be, hunched over, shaking, and You may have seen this picture before. I know that a lot of people who are in healthcare have seen this picture. But what I really want to talk about is how wrong this picture is, right? So this is kind of the old view of Parkinson's disease, and it's 2023 and it's changed, right? So we have so many good medicines that can help people. That can help people walk better, can calm down tremors, that can help people's rigidity, and can actually help all of the symptoms that we're going to talk about tonight. So some of the things that we might talk about might be a little tough, a little bit sad, but the important thing is that there are ways that we can intervene, okay? So there are definitely things that we can do to help a lot of the symptoms. And this is the updated view of Parkinson's, right? So just because you have Parkinson's disease doesn't mean you can't run, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you can't walk well. There's a lot of people, a lot of patients who are able to do a lot of things that they want to do. So I show these pictures mostly to say that the old view is gone, right? There's a new view, and there's a lot of ways that we can try to help. I'm going to skip through some of these, but the problem that we see in Parkinson's disease is that there are brain changes, right? So even though it's the hand that shakes, it's actually the brain that has abnormalities, and it's all related to this thing called dopamine. So dopamine, I'm sure you've heard of it, is a chemical in the brain that not just makes you happy, right? But in the Parkinson's or the movement disorder sense, it is actually the chemical that helps you to move smoothly. And in Parkinson's, we have decreased levels of dopamine. And when we have decreased levels of dopamine, we can have slowness, we can have tremor, we can have stiffness, walking trouble. And remember, those are those 4 cardinal features. The thing that I wanted to emphasize here is that there are other chemicals that are a little bit different in Parkinson's disease as well. So, I spend all my day thinking about dopamine, but tonight we're going to think about a different chemical and other neurochemicals that can cause some other symptoms of Parkinson's disease. So, whenever we're thinking about treating some of the motor symptoms, that's the movement, right? There's tremors, the stiffness, the slowness. We typically use medicines that simply try to replace the dopamine. So we have too little dopamine. What do we do but replace it? And that's a medication that we typically use called carbidopa. Now, has anyone heard of that medicine before? Right. So that's the most common medicine that we use, the gold standard. One of the cool things about that medicine is that that levodopa component is actually transformed into dopamine inside the brain, right? So it's actually filling the deficit or that hole. Sometimes I describe it as a hole in the backyard. It's actually filling up the hole to try to help you move better. And so dopamine is the answer in a lot of ways. Now, the carbidopa, levodopa, or Cinemet can work really, really well. Sometimes it doesn't work all day though. So there are other, what we call, just adjunctive medicines that help it to last a little bit longer. And that's not the point of the talk today, but just know that there are a lot of things that we can do. A lot of people come to me and say, oh, Cinemet, my dad used to be on that. Is that all you have still? Well, it's very, very effective still. We have so many other medicines that can be really, really helpful. So there's a lot of excitement in the Parkinson's disease world. So we talk about motor symptoms, right? There's 4 cardinal features. But oftentimes, patients say that, the motor symptoms are tough. I hate this tremor. But oftentimes we hear that the non-motor symptoms can actually be a little bit more difficult to deal with. So whether that is things like constipation, or some of the mood disorders or mental health disorders we'll talk about tonight, or whether that is fatigue, or whether that is autonomic dysfunction, where you're having a lot of constipation, or you have to use the restroom frequently, or you notice that you're sweating a lot more on one side of your body than the other. You just can't get your body to calm down. That's autonomic dysfunction. And then everyone can also have sleep disorders. Now, I use the fatigue and sleep disorders slide here just to say that if I slip up anything, whenever I'm speaking, just feel free to raise your hand and correct me. I've not slept a ton over the past few days, just with busy things at work. But I'm a little fatigued, but just know that as a FYI. So, let's get started. So, has anyone ever felt anxious before? So I see some hands over here, some hands over there. Yeah, there we go. One of the interesting things is that I see hands from people that I know have Parkinson's, and hands from people that I know don't have Parkinson's. And so that's one of the things that I wanted to emphasize is that anxiety is not necessarily specific to Parkinson's, right? So people with Parkinson's and without Parkinson's disease can have this. And when I think about anxiety, this is what I think about. a huge roller coaster, right? And for me, what that means is really two things. One, up, down, all around. Can't really focus on what I want to focus on because of the roller coaster. Right? But also think about it a little bit differently, where you're really excited about the roller coaster, you're just about to get on, but you're a little nervous, you're a little scared. You don't really know what the future is going to hold, right? You don't know what the future looks like. And that's one of the ways that we can view anxiety and Parkinson's disease. So one of the things that I find is that anxiety and actually depression can be a really early symptom in Parkinson's disease. So typically I'm always looking to see if a patient has tremor. But typically one of the things that they always tell me is that, or a family member might tell me is that, Charlie's been just a little bit more anxious than he used to be. He used to be really even-keeled. He used to not really worry about anything. But then all of a sudden now he's more anxious, right? And so that can be a really early symptom in Parkinson's disease. And I looked, and there's a lot of varying statistics about how common anxiety in Parkinson's disease is. And so that's why I chose to use the word pervasive. Mostly meaning it's very, very common. And I would argue that the supermajority, so probably even 90-95% of my patients have at least a little bit more anxiety than they used to have. And one of the things I think we should emphasize is that the anxiety in Parkinson's disease is not just a thing of, you've always been an anxious person, right? It can be actually part of the condition, right? It's not just you grew up and you're always anxious, but it can be part of the Parkinson's disease. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and why that is. So anxiety can start, I might be losing my mic here, but anxiety can start really quiet, right? Sometimes we don't even know that it's actually anxiety. So herein lies that phrase we talk about a lot called the internal tremor. Has anyone ever felt an internal tremor where they feel maybe their body inside is shaking? So I typically think that's one of two things. Either one that is literally a physical tremor, a movement that I just can't see with my eyes, but there's movement inside. But I think sometimes too that actually also might represent a little bit of anxiety, right? A little bit of feeling of internal uneasiness or just not feeling right. Not really being able to say, this is the problem or that's the problem. Or if I could just fix this, I would feel better. If I could fix that, life would be great. But it's just a feeling of, gosh, I just don't know what's not right in the world. I just don't feel like myself. Right? And that's very, very common in Parkinson's disease. And there can be a lot of other manifestations too, like sometimes someone's confidence can go down a little bit. They used to love planning vacations, but now whenever they're trying to plan a vacation, they're just not as able to kind of quickly make decisions, or they're unconfident, and they lack confidence to make those decisions for the vacation. So there's a lot of ways that anxiety can manifest. And what I want to emphasize is that it doesn't look the same for everybody, right? So it's a little bit different for each different person, right? And it's not necessarily the kind of stereotypical image where someone is kind of in a corner having a panic attack, right? That's not the way it looks. So we'll talk about different ways that these conditions can look specifically different in Parkinson's whenever we use depression. But just know that, there are a lot of things that contribute here, right? So one of the things that we talked about a few minutes ago is that dopamine deficit. Whenever there's not enough dopamine in the brain, people can feel a little bit more anxious. And we'll talk here shortly about a chemical called serotonin. But let's go back to that medicine carbidopa level. So who in here, if you want to raise your hand, feels like their medicine works and then doesn't work? And then they take it and it works again, and then it doesn't work. And they take it and it works again and it doesn't work. Does anyone feel that way ever? Yeah. So a lot of people, right? So this is what we call wearing off, right? Whenever medicine works for typically hours and stops working, you have to take another pill for it to kick back in, right? So a lot of my patients during their off time will feel actually very anxious. It's not just that the tremor comes back or that their walking is impaired, but they can become very anxious, right? They become very nervous. Kind of that old sense of, I just don't feel right anymore can return. So whenever we're talking about anxiety, we have to really first make sure that someone's medicines are right. Their carbidopa levodopa is really well timed, right? I saw some hands that I know, so let me know. Send me my chart message. We'll try to fix it, okay? Nora and I will help you out, right, Nora? That's really important to make sure that the carbidopa-levodopa dose is optimized. Now, what I wanted to mention is this. I feel like the year 2023 and 2022 is like the year of mental health, right? I think that's kind of from the pandemic. We're all kind of feeling that. We all don't feel great, right? No one's really, kicking on all cylinders. We don't feel well. But I think it's a good thing that we're talking more about mental health. But what I want to emphasize is that, I think that sometimes we can start to think, because everyone else is talking about mental health, we can think about it as a cliche. So if we're thinking about mental health just from let's be better, let's feel better about ourselves, and that kind of thing, let's stop, right? Because I really want to talk about serious issues here, right? Because in Parkinson's disease, anxiety can definitely be a very, very serious issue. And also it can be a serious issue for their caregivers too. So this basal ganglia thing we talked about, this is the reason that the dopamine is so important in our bodies, in our brains, right? And in Parkinson's, like I said, there's less dopamine. There's this other chemical called serotonin, right? Serotonin is a very important chemical that's in our brains that really needs to be at just the right levels, right? So too high up, too high down, we can have problems. And typically whenever we have decreased levels of serotonin in our body, we can have things like anxiety, or we can have things like depression. So, in other words, anxiety in Parkinson's disease doesn't necessarily come from a history of anxiety, it can actually come from the Parkinson's disease, right? And so what I would encourage you is if you're one of those people that never was anxious and never depressed, and now you feel, gosh, I just feel so bad and I feel so guilty, and why am I feeling all these ways? I would give you full ability to just blame it on the Parkinson's disease. If that doesn't work for you, blame it on you. But the goal of me talking about these things is really just to say, hey, this stuff is okay. This stuff are things that we can talk about. And they are not normal, but they can be typical, right? They're not things that we are nervous to talk about. So if you have any of these things that we're talking about, definitely bring it up, right? Talk about it with your caregiver. Talk about it with your spouse. Talk about it with your friends, your family. Talk about the people that care about you, because they definitely want to know. I know I do. So we're going to talk about interventions, ways to make that better here in a few minutes. But the reason we're going to skip that is because they're oftentimes the same. So sadness, grieving, and depression in Parkinson's disease. So what does depression in Parkinson's disease look like? So I would ask you to kind of think back a little bit to that time whenever you were maybe sitting in my office or sitting in someone else's office, and I or someone else said, I think based on what I see in front of me, I think you have Parkinson's disease, or I typically say a mild case of Parkinson's disease. So think back to that emotion, right? Do you remember that? Do you remember how you might have panicked, right? Or how you might have felt like, no, there's no way, he's definitely wrong. There's no way he's right. Or you might have felt angry. Or you might have felt very, very, very sad. And hopefully eventually you start to kind of accept, okay, well, this is what's going on. So, we've heard of this as the kind of 5 stages of grief. That's part of Parkinson's too, right? Whenever we're learning about our diagnosis or learning about these new symptoms that we're having, it kind of takes a little bit of time to kind of get used to them, right? To try to say, all right, this is what life is going to be like, right? And that's something that we have to think about. And one thing I would say is that, about a third of patients, right? At least a third of patients express some type of, say like dysphoria or some type of sadness, right? Whether that rises to the level of depression, or whether that's more of just grieving, or whether that is more just a decreased mood. But this decreased mood or depression and sadness can actually look a little bit different for everybody. So I don't know about you, but I think whenever I used to think about depression a few years ago, I used to think about it as a person laying in their bed eating ice cream, right? Just so sad, all they do is eat ice cream. Well, that's not what depression looks like, right? That's not what any of you guys feel like, right? If you have depression, it can take a lot of different forms. And the way that I look at it oftentimes is that it can not only affect our moods, right? But it can actually affect our walking and our tremor. And it can actually affect the way that our medicine works, right? Whether the carbidopa-levodopa is not actually working super well. Even exercise can be more arduous. I don't know about you guys, but a run or going to the gym or going to Rock City Boxing isn't as exciting if I'm not happy. Right? It's not as exciting. It's not as encouraging. It's seems a little bit more exhausting even, right? It seems more like a weight on me. And so when I think about depression and Parkinson's disease, I think a lot about this, where you don't enjoy the things you used to, right? It's more like, you used to really enjoy going to rock steady boxing, but it's just not fun anymore. It's just not worth it anymore, right? Or you used to really enjoy going to this restaurant with your family, and they're still going, but you just kind of maybe prefer to stay at home, right? And don't have as much desire or drive or excitement that comes out of actually going to the restaurant, right? Or you kind of want everyone to just go without you, right? So that's the way that depression can actually look in Parkinson's disease. And it's important, right? Because all of these things that we want to be doing, can become harder with depression, right? So really what I'm trying to communicate is that I think depression certainly impacts your mood, but it also impacts your walking. It impacts your whole life. And why am I saying this? Because I think that we can do things about it, right? Because we can actually make it better. I don't know about you, but it seems to me like a lot of people who have depression feel guilty about it, right? Why do I feel this way? Or, I know in some religious communities there's a thought of, gosh, I don't have enough faith, or I just don't believe enough. Or maybe if I did more of this or more of that, or I exercised more of this or that, I would just be better. I just feel really guilty about it. But today, on Thursday, June 8th, you don't have to feel guilty about it anymore, right? It's the Parkinson's. It's Robert. Blame it on me. So anyways, I just wanted to encourage you that there are really good ways that we can try to treat depression and anxiety and Parkinson's disease. So how do you know if we're depressed? Right? So this is actually part of what's called the geriatric depression scale. I apologize for the word geriatric. I did not put it up there. Okay? But it is up there, and there's a good scale. And it's something that I can look at too, actually, and just try to ask these questions myself, right? To see how I kind of. So, am I basically satisfied with my life? Do I have hope about the future of my life? Am I most of the times in good spirits? Outside of Monday morning, am I in good spirits? Do I feel happy most of the time? Do I feel worthless the way I am now? Do I feel like people don't care about me? These are real questions that I think we can actually ask ourselves. And I know these are sad questions, but I think it's important to ask these honest questions, because what we can do is figure out and help one another out whether we are actually depressed or not. So, just like I said with anxiety, depression may sound like a super cliche topic in 2023. It's really, really important. It's a serious topic in Parkinson's disease. So, here we go. I've talked a lot about sadness. I'm sorry. I don't know about you, but I feel a weight, right? I feel really weighty right now. But now we can talk about the good things, okay? Ways to make all of this better, right? So, one of the first things to do is to talk about it, right? We don't have to suffer through these things alone, right? I oftentimes will have patients say something like, I know you're not my counselor, and I'm not here for marriage counseling, or I know you're not my psychiatrist. It's like, no, what else am I here for, it can be a tough process, tough conversations, but definitely share with someone that you think cares, right? Whether that's your spouse, or your best friend, or your child, your doctor, your therapist, your psychiatrist, your pastor, anyone that cares, right? So talk about it and share your experience, your notes, anything with your team. I always like to say, lists are great. I love to walk into a room and see a list of questions, because it means that by the end of this visit, I'm going to actually be able to help, right? I'm going to be able to answer specific questions. I always walk into a room with a set of like 5 to 6 questions that I've got to ask. But oftentimes those don't really hit the mark, right? What I would much prefer is that if there's anxiety or depression going on, that we're talking about that, And then down here I'll give the permission to loved ones, friends, family, caregivers to say, hey, if they're not talking about it, you talk about it, right? Definitely talk about these things. That's really, really important. And so what are the ways that we actually fix these or make these things a little bit better? So I talked a little bit about this, but the Parkinson's disease medicines, the carbidopa, levodopa, it's really important that medicine is as smooth as possible, right? If it's not smooth, it's really rocky, up, down, all around, then you can have more tremor, more trouble walking, but you can also have more anxiety and more depression, right? A lot of my patients don't feel so good when they're off. They get much more negative, right? They feel like the world is a different place. They take their medicine, 30, 45 minutes later, they feel great. So we gotta make sure that Parkinson's disease medicines are optimized, like I said. And then we gotta do this other thing, and I will be the first to say I am not good at any of this, okay? Before we start new meds, we gotta take care of ourselves, take care of our body, right? So up here on the podium, I have two things. I have a bottle of water, and I have a bottle of Diet Pepsi, and you can tell that Diet Pepsi is halfway gone, and the seal of the water is not even open, right? And so, I always take great care of myself. Right? So whenever we're having any symptoms of Parkinson's disease, particularly mental health systems, I think we have to stop. Take a step back and say, all right, I'm an important person, right? I gotta take care of myself. Right? So am I drinking enough water? Am I eating well? Right? Are there any new changes going on? Did I stop going to rock steady boxing? Or, is there something going on at home where I'm really stressed out about work? Or does my kid keep nagging me about this problem they're having? They just won't leave me alone, right? Is that what's going on? Is that what's causing my anxiety and depression? We need to be honest about all these things and really try to focus on the things that are good for us, right? So yeah, water's probably better for us than Diet Pepsi. But those are the things, a good place to start, right? The cool thing about that, none of those stuff you need a prescription for, right? None of those things come with side effects, right? None of those things have interactions with any of your medicines. And now, the other thing that I would say is, don't get stuck in an anxious doom spiral, right? And so if you feel like you're stuck inside, you just don't want to go out, or you feel so sad that you can't make yourself get up. Do something, schedule something, get something on your calendar, call up a friend, tell someone, hey, I'm going to go to the Jewish Community Center to work out, will you meet me there? Right? That's really important, because that's just motivation to get out of bed, right? To get out of the couch, up off the couch, to get outside, and to get out of this spiral, right? I was listening to a few different resources with different recommendations on some of these mental health topics, and one of the best ideas talked about going to the Humane Society, right? Go to a pet shelter, spend time with pets. Who doesn't care if you shave? Dog or cat don't really care. Pets love us unconditionally, right? So don't worry about being seen or being embarrassed because you have this symptom or that symptom. Get out, go hang out with animals, right? It's great. Go out to a park, enjoy a good view. That's a great idea. Volunteer at the library, community gardens, that kind of thing. Now, counseling is something that, I don't know, whenever I talk about it with my patients, I typically get either a blank stare or roll the eyes back and oh, I'm not going to do that. That's just not going to help. Right? And, I think, let's be honest, there are probably good counselors and there are probably bad counselors. By evidence that there are good doctors and there are bad doctors, right? There are a lot of different varieties of everybody. But what I would encourage you to do is consider talking about some of these issues, right? So before we even start medications, I really oftentimes recommend that someone at least consider talking with a counselor, whether that's a social worker or a therapist, or sometimes seeing a psychologist or a psychiatrist. These are all really, really important things because they can help with both individual problems now, right? Like, my spouse really wants me to go on this trip with them and it is stressing me out. Right? You talk about that. Or you can talk about more long-term problems, right? More chronic issues to make sure that all the things that we want to do in life are possible. I won't repeat myself other than saying we got to make sure that your Parkinson's disease meds are optimized as possible. And then there are other good medicines, right? We call them antidepressants. And they are very common in the world. A lot of people are on these medicines, and they can be very, very helpful, actually. They help in really two ways. Thankfully, they're called antidepressants, but a few of them are actually really good to treat depression and actually to treat anxiety as well. Right? So two birds with one stone, right? Less side effects, less reactions. So some of the most popular ones are called serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors. Remember a few minutes ago, I was talking about how in Parkinson's you can have less serotonin, and that can lead to depression, anxiety, those kind of things. Well, there are medicines that will actually keep that around a little bit longer, right? Keep the serotonin around a little bit longer, so you'll have more. There are other medicines too that can help, different types of depression medicines, and then even some of our Parkinson's disease medicines Ones like pramipexole, Requip, Nupro can all be helpful a little bit, at least, to kind of give you a little more energy, a little bit more boost in your day. One thing I would say is there are certain antipsychotic medications that sometimes are used for depression. Not for you guys. They're not good. So always check, particularly any mental health medicine, check with your Parkinson's disease doctor just to make sure it's actually safe for you. Okay? And then I'll leave you for this topic with this picture. Do what you want to do. Right? Do something that makes you smile, makes you happy. Right? It's your life. Right? Do something that makes you happy. And also, I would say, do something that makes you happy now. Right? Don't keep pushing it down. Don't keep just dealing with it. Right? Do something about it now. So, anyways, that's what I was excited to talk about. Now, let's talk about hallucinations. Okay, so this is a little bit of a different topic, but we're going to go there. So, there's this thing called psychosis, and psychosis sounds scary. Right? Doesn't it sound pretty scary? Well, psychosis, I think, is not quite as scary as Parkinson's disease as we oftentimes think about it is. There are a lot of different ways that this can manifest, and I think that typically whenever I first talk about starting medicine, one of the first things people think is this, right? What is this going to look like? And will I have hallucinations or that kind of thing in the future? So hallucinations can happen. The data is a little bit varied about how frequently it can happen, but it's somewhere between maybe 10 to 20% of people throughout their entire life or their entire course of Parkinson's. But what I would say though is that there are things outside of Parkinson's disease that cause hallucinations, right? And so it's not just that you have Parkinson's disease that you have that you can have hallucinations. It's all these other things. So other people who don't have Parkinson's disease, they can have hallucinations as well. Okay. So what are hallucinations? So hallucinations are more or less when you, and we're going to talk about the most common ones in Parkinson's. They're more or less when you see something that's not actually there. So that could be a little small bug scampering on the ground. Or it could be, you think you might see someone in your corner of your kind of peripheral vision walking by. And you look and no one's there. Okay, so that could be a hallucination. Or sometimes it takes a little bit more of a formed shape where there can be actually an animal or a pet there, or maybe someone that you know, you see them briefly and you look, and they're not actually there. Those are technically hallucinations, and we always like to ask whether someone has insight. What insight means is like, you know, do you know that that bug is not actually there? Do you know that that dog that's in your house is actually not there? And that's really important, because that helps guide how we deal with these things, right? Do we need to actually start a new medicine, or do we not need to start a new medicine? And so, you know, I talked about the prevalence of these, but the thing that I would emphasize is that they can look a little bit different for everybody. And the most common, like I said, are visual hallucinations, okay? And then the less common, but it still can happen, is auditory hallucinations. So like I said, typically familiar things, you know, people that you know, animals, that would be common. Now, what are the risk factors for these hallucinations? Why might we actually have them? And why in Parkinson's disease are they a little bit more common? So some of those brain changes can make us more likely to have hallucinations. The decreases in the dopamine requiring medicines can actually cause it as well. So the fact that we're putting you on a medicine like carbidopa levodopa, or this dopamine agonist, or amantadine, all of these medicines can make us just a little bit more likely to have hallucinations. And I'll talk more about that in a second. And then of course, other medications and illnesses, right? So one of the first things that I do is, if someone has these hallucinations, we almost always will send them directly to their primary care doctor to get their urine checked, right? Because urinary tract infections, or things like the flu, or COVID, or even blood clots in the legs, can actually make people have hallucinations, right? It's an easy fix. You go on an antibiotic for a week, and they're gone. That's really, really important. So what do? We always look for other reasons, right? Are medications causing it? Is there a medical provoking factor? Is there insight? Or are they even bothersome? And then we can start talking about medication. So there are medication options to treat these symptoms, hallucinations, or other types of psychosis, we call it. one of the first things we do is really take a good look at your Parkinson's disease medicines, right? Do we need to be on these high doses? So I know my patients get a little what at me whenever they're still tremoring and they say, oh, well, I want to increase my medicine to see if it helps. And we can try that, but the way that we try to prevent some of these hallucinations in the future is just by really being thoughtful about our medicines, right? So sometimes it makes total sense in the world to increase the carbidopa levodopa or the cinnamon, increase it a little bit. But sometimes it doesn't, right? And so that's why I recommend that if you have Parkinson's, you make sure your doctor knows what they're talking about, right? You make sure that they know how to use these medicines well, to slowly increase the medicines to target the symptoms they're having to avoid these side effects. So the medicines in and of themselves are not scary, right? They're not things that just cause hallucinations right off the bat. It's really the kind of really increasing them at really high level in conjunction with infections, that kind of thing, that can make hallucinations happen. So there are two specific medications that I turn to pretty quickly before I get there. Oftentimes there's a dementia medicine that we can use to try to calm down hallucinations a little bit, and that can help mildly. And then there are other medicines that are a little bit more aggressive that we can try, and those are two different types of antipsychotics called quetiapine or Seroquel or pimavanserin or Nuplazid. There are FDA warnings about these medicines that I'll talk about here in a second. And then sometimes there's an even stronger medicine that we can use. So one of the things that is important, I think, about treating these hallucinations is to make sure we understand them really well, right? So I remember a patient of mine, she lived in a nursing home, and her and her daughter came in, and her daughter said, we've got to get these hallucinations to stop. I said, all right, well, tell me about the hallucinations. And her mother said, well, sometimes about 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night, I'm sitting in my living room den area, and I look over, and there's my late husband. And it brings me so much joy, comfort, happiness to see my late husband sitting there with me. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a hallucination that you probably shouldn't treat, right? That probably brings joy, that probably brings happiness, that's probably very, very soothing. So just because we're having hallucinations doesn't mean we actually have to treat them. And this is more of a kind of a thought I'm sharing with loved ones, caregivers, friends, families, that kind of thing. So there's this black box warning that technically says that some of these medicines can increase the risk of death, which sounds scary, right? It's kind of the ultimate fulfillment of all of these medication commercials that we see on the television, right? So you could either be running around in a field happy and jolly, or you could die if you have the side effects, right? That's what we all worry about. But I think it's really important to actually think very, very critically about this black box warning. So first off, I'll say this. I use these medicines every day of my life, except for Saturday and Sunday, right? I use these medicines all the time and feel very comfortable prescribing them in the right patients. I like to let them know about this. But I think what we have to realize is that a lot of times whenever we have these hallucinations, there's other things going on, right? We're also already maybe have other sicknesses that can contribute to these things. So ultimately, my personal feeling is that though the FDA, the black box warning says this, I think we have to really think about it closely, right? And this is not something that keeps me from prescribing it. I use it very, very often, and I do not think that in my clinical practice I have seen that this black box warning kind of plays itself out. So those are my comments on that. We can talk more about that in our question and answer session. Cognition, if time allows, it doesn't because my timer just went off. I can talk about that a little after. But my parting thoughts, this is exactly what I shared last year here, okay? It's really important to find a great primary care doctor because I don't know how to treat your blood pressure. I just don't. I might hurt you. It's really important that we kind of create this team, right? Just as important that you have your own team at home. It's important that we have a team here for you. So I'm very biased, but I recommend that if you have Parkinson's, you see a movement disorders trained physician who knows kind of how to use these medicines. Keep a list of all of your updated medications. Bring it with you to every appointment. The computer and the system is never right. I promise you, it's never right. So always bring a list of your medicines with you. If Do something safe that's outside your comfort zone every week. And don't wait for a phone call from your family or friends to get you to talk or to catch up. You call them, right? Don't wait for them, you call them. And then, like I was saying with the dog running down the path with stick in his mouth, do something that makes you happy, right? Do something that you're going to enjoy. There's a lot of tough things going on in the world right now. And Parkinson's disease is a very tough condition. So you deserve it. You've earned it, right? Find something that makes you happy, right? Do something that you're going to enjoy. And at the end of the day, eat the extra cookie. Go for it. It's probably fine. Okay. All right. Well, I will pause here. But I wanted to just say thank you for listening. These are really tough topics, and I know that they might bring up a lot of discussions, which are good, right? Keep talking with everybody. I think that only one mic is going to work at a time, so you guys use that one, and I'll raise my voice. Any questions for anybody?
Like he said, any time for questions. So just raise your hand if you have a question.
Go ahead.
So, very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing.
Sure, yeah, you're welcome.
What were you going to say about cognition?
So I'm going to raise my voice. So the question was, what was I going to say about cognition? I'll give that to you in maybe 30 seconds, and I can send you an email later. But what I would say about cognition is this, is that, I have trouble remembering things, right? I walk into a room and cannot remember why I went into that room, right? So there's a certain level of cognitive change that are just normal. And it's because you're not sleeping well, or you're not hydrated, or you're just really tired, right? In Parkinson's disease, though, and in other folks as we get older, we do have a risk of having more profound cognitive troubles. We start to worry about something called dementia whenever, by the way, I'm yelling and I'm not angry, which is why everyone here. We start to worry about dementia whenever someone both scores low on cognitive screens, so has some actual objective trouble with their memory, but also that their functioning in daily life is impaired. So just the fact that you sometimes can't find where your keys are doesn't mean you have dementia. I actually have beepers on my keys because I cannot find them in the mornings, right? That does not mean I have dementia, it means that I'm just tired. And so the other thing I would say is that there are medicines to help a little bit with dementia. One of the interesting things is that some people feel like that the medicines for Alzheimer's dementia actually work better in Parkinson's disease dementia. And so as long as there's no side effects, couldn't hurt to try. But we like to make sure that someone actually meets the criteria for dementia before just throwing them on new medicines. So yeah, a little bit of a summary there.
Okay, and then as a follow-up,
Sure.
is Aricept an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor?
Yes, yeah, so Aricept or donepezil, same thing, generic and brand name, is a medicine that can treat, technically it's FDA approved for Alzheimer's dementia, but that's typically my kind of first go-to in someone who's having memory troubles in Parkinson's disease.
Thank you.
You're welcome. What other questions are there that we can try to answer?
Yes. You talked about this early on, and I'm probably going into your next segment of another conversation, because we think this is our third that we've heard you. But you mentioned sleep issues,
Oh yeah.
and I don't know whether you want to touch on that now, but that's been his biggest problem in the last few months.
Yeah.
He had DBS surgery in
Okay,
September.
great.
And so he's off of most of his meds and everything's great from that standpoint. But I mean, he does some of the earth-shattering, screeching stuff at night.
Yeah. Are you actually screeching?
Yeah, I'm dreaming and I kind of play out dreams.
So I look at sleeping in Parkinson's disease. Oh yeah, sorry about it. Yeah, absolutely, sorry. So the question was, can you talk a little bit about sleep in Parkinson's disease? And the specific question sounded to be more like kind of overactive dreaming, loud noises, that kind of thing. So I would kind of quickly respond and say that I kind of look at sleep in two ways. One is I can't sleep enough, or three ways. I can't sleep enough, I sleep too much during the daytime, And then the third would be that I sleep, but I sleep in a funny way. So with trouble sleeping, I try to make sure that the medications are actually really finely tuned as well as possible, because if you're shaking or you're feeling tight, rigid, you can't sleep well. The middle section, if you're feeling sleepy during the daytime, it's really important that one will make sure that your nighttime actually is sleeping well, that you don't have something like sleep apnea, that you're waking up a lot to go to the bathroom, or that you have just something called Parkinson's disease-related fatigue. Sometimes we can actually use stimulant medicines that I use rarely, but can use them to help the fatigue in Parkinson's disease. So that's kind of that middle category. And this other category is a mix of something called REM sleep behavior disorder, where people can act out their dreams. It's not very commonly that people actually vocalize, but it's mostly they're just moving their arms. They can have vocalizations. There's also vivid dreams where people act out their dreams. There's also night terrors. And so one of the kind of questions I would ask would be, what is actually causing those, of those three? Because we could treat them in different ways. Sometimes people need a good sleep study where they actually watch the night terrors, the REM sleep behavior disorder, that kind of a thing. Otherwise, one thought would be that we could use like sedative medicines. And my last thought would be, sometimes a little bit of melatonin can maybe help some of these things. They're all just have a few medicines that we were not sure what to do. We just kind of throw them at people, and one of them is melatonin, and it works really well for a lot of different things. So not a complete answer, but feel free to grab me afterwards and I can try to answer a little bit more. Go ahead.
Hi, yes, I just had a clarification. So when you're talking about the meds for depression, you said no antipsychotics.
Yeah, well, so, and I might have misspoken. What I really meant was there are specific antipsychotics that we should not use. So in depression, outside of Parkinson's disease, sometimes people will use antipsychotics that can treat depression. But in Parkinson's disease, antipsychotics can actually worsen Parkinson's symptoms. But there are 3 antipsychotics that are felt to be significantly less likely to do that. Those are the ones I talked about: the Seroquel or quetiapine, Nuplazid or pimavanserin, and then clozapine or clozaril. So mostly you can be on an antidepressant and an antipsychotic at the same time. If you have Parkinson's disease, you want to make sure that antipsychotic does not make your Parkinson's worse.
Okay, so to that point, I had a client with the Parkinson's and hallucinations. We tried Seroquel, and it had such a really quick reaction to it that I had to go to her and get her home from the hospital and sit with her until it passed.
Yeah.
And so the doctor said to us, well, the positive thing about hallucinations is that the brain, when she's having these hallucinations, she's not distraught. We could talk about it. She would think it was snowing outside,
Yeah.
or swimming goes, or a man, but she wasn't afraid. He said the brain basically takes the hallucinations and says to you, don't worry, they're okay, so you're not afraid. Is that true? I mean, it made me feel better, but I wasn't.
Yeah, I think my response to that would be that, hallucinations are very different for a lot of people. Sometimes they can be very, very comforting. The question was, is it true that your brain kind of protects you from being scared of hallucinations? I think sometimes hallucinations can be very comforting and very soothing and be like, oh, I don't really care that that's there. It's there, but it's not really bothersome. There are cases, though, where people do have hallucinations that can be scary and can be alarming, or different paranoia type things. And those are definitely the more type of hallucinations that would be more, proactive to treat, to try to prevent 911 from being called, that kind of a thing. So, I'm not sure of the exact, patient case, and I don't want to contradict another provider, but in my experience, hallucinations can be, at times, soothing to who cares, to also be, bothersome and frightening sometimes. Yeah. So I might disagree. Go ahead, sir.
Anosmia. Anything new?
Yeah, so the question was anosmia. Is there anything new? And anosmia is whenever you can't smell at all, or hyposmia is when you can't smell quite as well. If I could quickly go back, so the reason that people have trouble smelling early on, about 5 to 10 years before they are diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, is because the changes that happen in the brain are actually slowly working their way up the brainstem. There you go. So you see these arrows kind of slowly working its way up. So there's it starts to involve the areas of the brain where we're trying to smell from, the nuclei of where we're smelling, and they can kind of become destroyed, making you not be able to smell as well. And to be honest with you, I don't think that I'm not aware of any medications or kind of therapies to help that. And I'm also be honest with you, I'm not aware of any research trials looking into that right now. But I bet that's very, very bothersome that you're having that. Is that something that you experience yourself, or?
Smell.
Yeah. So no medicines right now to fix smelling in Parkinson's disease. No research trials that I'm aware of, but hopefully there will be one soon.
You can live with it, but it's,
I know.
you miss a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's 6:44. Maybe a time for maybe one question, maybe a two question. I can hang out a little bit later and answer others.
So we'll take one more question and then we'll go ahead.
In the beginning, you mentioned something about prolonging effects of DOPA. Can you expand on that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So when I said DOPA, I was meaning the medication called carbidopa-levodopa. So, sometimes patients feel really good. They take the medicine and feel really good. And then 3 or 4 hours later, they start to not feel so good. And then they take another pill and they can feel really good. And then a few hours later, they don't feel so good. So there are some medicines that will try to make the good effect last a little bit longer by preventing the breakdown of the dopamine. And there are other medicines that are more extended release to try to kind of create a more smooth type level of the dopamine. And the reason that's important is just because when it's not working, some people don't feel well. Now, 50% of people will never feel like their medicine stops working. And so if you're sitting there, seeing me move my hands up and down all around, and you're like, I don't know what he's doing. Like, I don't feel that way. It's okay. You're among 50% of people with Parkinson's disease. So just because you don't have those fluctuations doesn't mean you don't have Parkinson's disease. It's very common for people not to have that. So.
But are there medications to offset that?
Yeah, there are medicines that can make it last a little bit longer. They typically will only extend the effect for like 30, 45, maybe an hour. And there are other more extended release medicines that can be helpful. Sometimes instead of adding a medicine, I will just go from like 3 times a day to 4 times a day to try to get that added benefit. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for listening to me and for coming out. I really, really appreciate you listening and talking about these really difficult issues. Thanks to the Parkinson Association of Carolinas for having me. Thanks for Acadia for sponsoring the event. And I'll hang out a little bit longer to answer questions. I think we have a kind of a 7 p.m. curfew for getting out of here. So if you wouldn't mind kind of gather stuff up around your desk and throw it in the trash can for us. Anyway.